Okay. And the folks start rolling in. All right. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll give it a few minutes for people to get logged in and then get started. All righty. Well, I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dan Waldvogel. I work for the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union. Happy to be here today, and welcome to Colorado Grain Chain's homeschool webinar series. I guess we're at 16 now, so thank you for joining us today. Today is all about rye. We have Julie Zavage, David Kaminer, and Andy Clark will be assisting as well today. It should be a wonderful program. We are going to go perhaps close to 90 minutes as well, just a heads up, but we are recording this too. So if you have to log off early, you'll be able to access that through a link on coloradograinchain.com. Before we get started, just a reminder, if you want to ask any questions, the best way to do that is to use the Q&A function. We do have the chat box, which can work, but the best way to kind of be able to get questions in there and collate them is through the Q&A function. So please use that. One other announcement you might have noticed last week, we've been promoting Bake Sale, supporting some of the organizations in our state in Colorado that are working against racism. And that Bake Sale has been postponed from last week to October 17th and 18th. So look forward to more announcements for that and ways that you can support some great organizations and get some great products at the same time. I guess I'll get around and provide just a real brief introduction to our speakers. So Julie Zavage, she's secretary for the board at Colorado Grain Chain. She's worked in the milling industry in the Northeast. She also works now with her partner on their farm in Howard, Colorado, and is a licensed clinical social worker. We also have David Kaminer. David owns and operates Raleigh Street Bakery in Denver. He opened the store in 2015 after a career in baking in different areas across the country. We also have Andy Clark. He'll be cameraman, jumping in there with good questions and filling in the cracks. Andy is a baker and owner of Moxie Bread with stores in Louisville and Boulder now. And he's also the chair of Colorado Grain Chain. So with all of that, I think I'll just hand it directly over to Julie and we'll get started. But thank you all for joining today.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here for our Grain Homeschool on Rye. I am a huge fan of rye bread, and I am also a big fan of rye as part of an organic farm system or a sustainable farm system, and that's what I'm going to take the next 10 or 15 minutes to talk about, just why rye is so important to a regional grain economy. So I'm going to start in with just a few of the growing characteristics for rye, and then we'll kind of look at it more as a whole and look at how it fits into the farm system and why it may be good for your local farmers and your local bakers and millers. So rye is a winter grain, which means that we sow it in the fall, and usually it germinates in the fall, and then it overwinters in what we call the tillering stage, which is kind of the plants have a few leaves on them, and they kind of hang out in that phase over the winter. And then once the spring comes, they resume growth and they move into reproductive phase, and we typically harvest that following summer. The plants actually require vernalization, which is the word for they need that winter period of cold in order to move into the reproductive phase. And, you know, in part because of that, there are lots of winter grains, but rye in particular is extremely winter hardy and extremely cold hardy. It's the most cold hardy of all the winter grains. But it's also extremely drought tolerant. And this is in part because it has a really large root system. The root system is 20 to 30% larger than modern wheats, which also allows it to thrive in soils that are not necessarily as fertile or don't have as much nutrients as other soils. So it is typically, you'll see it grown in places where the soils are not quite as high of quality, in like where wheat may be grown. Rye is also very tall. It can be, with too much nitrogen, it can grow up to 8 feet, at which height it would be very prone to lodging. So if you're growing it for a cover crop, which many farmers do, and you want to be adding organic matter to the soil, this is great because it puts on a ton of biomass, and then you can till that back into the soil. If you're growing it for grain, it may be problematic because really tall grains like that, especially if you're in a windy place, can be prone to lodging, which just means that the plant falls over. And if the plant's on the ground, you can't get the seed or the grain out with your combine. So that can actually lead to pretty significant yield losses. But with the right nutrient management, rye is, it can yield probably on average right around especially what heirloom wheats can yield. It's very close to that, and probably a little less than what modern wheats can yield, but kind of right in that same range as wheat. Rye is beloved as a cover crop due to its vigorous growth in the cool early and late season. So you can plant it quite late and still get a good stand to go into winter. And that is really useful, particularly because it holds soil in place and can prevent soil erosion in those early spring times whenever sometimes we have a lot of snow melt, or if we have a rainy spring, it's tough to, if you've got bare soil, to prevent erosion. So any winter cover crop, but the rye, it resumes its growth so early in the spring while it's still cool. So it's very useful for preventing soil erosion. It's also extremely competitive against weeds, partially just due to that natural vigor and that really large, intense root system. But also rye in particular exhibits strong allelopathy. And allelopathy is a characteristic of plants, and actually most plants do this. They exude chemicals from their roots, and for some plants, those chemicals inhibit the growth of other plants. So rye in particular, the chemicals that its roots exude, they they actually prevent the germination of pigweed, lamb's quarters, purslane, and crabgrass. And it can also impact other plants as well, but in particular, there have been studies that show that those weeds, which are really common annual weeds, that can be really problematic in cover type crops or grain crops. It really helps against those weeds. So that's another reason why rye is so often used as a cover crop. A few other just characteristics that I'll just point out is that rye is cross-pollinated, whereas most of our wheats are self-pollinated. So you can grow two varieties next to each other and not worry about them crossing, but rye will actually cross. So it's better to grow, and they're pollinated by wind, and the pollen can be carried quite far. So if you're trying to keep your rye for seed, you just want to grow one variety at a time and be aware of what your neighbors are growing. It's also a free threshing grain, which makes it a lot easier to process than some of the ancient wheats like spelt, einkorn, or emmer. And it is also one of the tougher things about rye, if you're going to grow it for grain, is that it's more prone to ergot than other cereal crops. And ergot is a fungal disease that does infect most cereal crops like wheat, barley, even oats. But rye is particularly prone to it. So you just have to take care with your management, and it's usually able to be cleaned out if you have the right equipment. But rye often kind of gets relegated to being a cover crop in these types of organic systems, but it's really a wonderful grain crop, in part because it is tolerant to so many different conditions. A farmer can really rely on getting a crop out of rye. Compared to rye, I would say wheat is maybe not extremely, but is pretty finicky in terms of how much nitrogen it needs and the conditions that need to be in place during flowering so that you don't get certain funguses or certain diseases. And then the quality is highly affected by these different conditions during the growing season. Whereas rye, it's very steady. It's very reliable. You'll never get a really huge yield out of it, but it's also, you can really count on getting a nice yield from it. So it's something that if you have a farmer growing a small or a medium scale grain rotation for their local or regional grain economy, it's a very reliable crop. And based on its value to the soil, value against weeds, it can help to have a really positive ecological impact on a farm. And I have a few pictures of rye that I'm going to share with you all in just a second. So this is a picture of some grain trials that we did on our farm in Howard. And the small patch, the rectangular patch that's right in the front, um, that is a variety of wheat. And the trials were done through UCCS with Nana Meyer. And if you look at the patch right in the front and then the patch right next to it, these are all winter grains that were planted the fall before, and then this is early spring. You can see that the cottonwoods in the back are just starting to put on a little flush of green. And you can tell that the wheat is quite a bit larger. I don't have, it's not exactly, it's not a perfect measurement there, but you can see that it looks quite a bit more vigorous and larger than the wheat patch directly to its right. So I just wanted to show that example of the winter hardiness and the way that the rye really can make use of the early and late seasons when it's too cool for wheat to continue growing. I'm not sure why oh, there we go. So here's a picture on the right-hand side of wheat heads, or sorry, rye heads that are ready to be harvested. I just think that they're a really beautiful grain to look at. And in the rye heads, it's really interesting. Just by looking at it, you can actually kind of see the seeds. They're just ready to fall right out of the head. And that's quite a different look from wheat or most of the other grains. And then on the left-hand side, this is a picture of a cover crop system that my husband Adam came up with that same year. And it was really interesting. He grew the rye until it was about in this stage that you see here. It was starting to head and it was flowering, but not yet putting on grain. And then he mowed it down. And then it grew. Actually, he mowed it and then he planted buckwheat. So you can see that there's an understory of buckwheat in that left-hand picture. And then the buckwheat and the rye kind of grew back together. And now this rye is again at the stage where it's flowering again. And then he mowed this and tilled this back into the soil. So he got a huge amount of organic matter that he was able to till back into the soil, and a really exceptional coverage from weeds on that section where he wasn't growing a cash crop that year. And then this picture is just because that was all that both the rye for grain and the rye for cover crop were all the same planting. There was just a section that we left and didn't mow. So this is just a cool picture of that second growth of rye that's still green and that rye that we left to go to seed. So that is all that I've got for pictures. And I guess the last thing that I just would put out there is that essentially rye has sort of always been the grain of the people. It's been the grain, in some ways I might say the grain of the poor. You know, wheat is really our sort of more, has always been more of like the grain of the wealthy. And so there's really value, and part of that is because we can rely on the wheat. It's not that it's not as finicky. It can be grown in more marginal soils, and it really benefits our farm ecosystem. And part of what I think that we need to do in our regional grain economy is we need people there needs to be demand for these grains so that we can have actually a very stable grain economy in Colorado. And if you are able to eat some delicious sourdough rye bread, I think that it would not be a problem to understand why, how this fits into the system. I was going to talk a little bit about nutrition, but I'm going to leave it because we should get to the baking. So I'll hand it back over to Dan.
Oh, thank you, Julie. Yeah, and that was just really beautiful pictures and everything. We've gotten some comments, and one question from Richard was just asking about the location. So do you want to speak any more about your guys' farm and where those beautiful pictures are taken?
Absolutely. Yeah, the farm is in, like Dan said, Howard, Colorado, and Howard is right at the base of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. So it's kind of between the Sangre de Cristos and the Arkansas River. We're about maybe 15 miles east of Salida. And the
Great.
mountains that you were seeing in the background there, we call them the Twin Sisters.
Yeah, it's just absolutely gorgeous. Well, thank you so much. And yeah, hopefully we do have some time to get into some of the nutritional benefits as well, because that's certainly interesting. But yeah, at this point, we'll pass it over to David and we'll get into some baking. This will be great.
We on? Looking good?
Yep,
Hey,
we're looking good. All right.
awesome. Thanks for joining us today here for our talk about rye. Julie, that was awesome. It's so great to hear all that you had to share, and I'm fortunate enough to actually be using Julie's rye today. Julie invited me up, I don't know, over this summer, and was able to pick up some of her rye this past summer. So it's really great to be able to use it in all my breads and tell all my customers about her story and everything. But yeah, so today we're going to be demoing how to do a whole grain rye bread. This particular rye bread has some toasted sunflower seeds in it. It has a little ground caraway seed. But other than that, it's all just flour, water, and salt. It is going to be a sourdough bread. One thing that rye really needs that acidity to help it build strength. So sourdough, if you're making 100% whole grain rye bread, is really going to help just help that rye hold together and make sure it's going to bake up really nice for you. So as I said, we're going to be demoing. I've got a little bit of TV magic today. I've had to stage a lot of stuff to kind of get all the pieces to work within this hour. So I'm going to get right to it and start with some of the demonstrations. So first, whenever you have your rye bread, the first stage, and actually if you, I think Kim linked to it in the comments, but there's actually a formula and a process that if you want to pull it up and look at it, you can kind of follow along with the process. But with rye bread, you need to build up a lot of starter in order to increase that acidity, so that way your bread will hold together. So in order to do that, you need to kind of start your starter the day before and build it up to get the right volume. So to do that, let me just grab my starter. It's in the refrigerator real quick. And generally for me, I store my starter in the fridge when I'm not using it. And this one I made here is enough what we need for our demo today. And it also has some extra, so that way, whenever I go to make bread the next time, I have some that I can start with. So normally I keep about 100 to 150 grams on hand in the refrigerator between bakes. So, you don't really need a whole lot. So for this first stage, I'm actually going to be building these a little bit bigger just because I'm going to be making this rye bread tomorrow. So these are actually going to be some of the mixes I'm going to be using for my actual bread. But so first you're going to need to start with this starter number one here. So it says we need 60 grams rye flour and 60 grams water and then 30 grams of starter. So as I said, these are a little bit bigger, so I'm going to go ahead. This is my flour is already weighed out. Sorry, good.
You want water? Or are you good? You want me to grab water?
This has to be hot.
Okay.
Get my water in here. The water has to be a little hot, just so that way, because I got cold starter, I want to make sure I get my starter up over a certain temperature. So first I like to put my starter into the container. And normally this is already, like I said, I pull it right out of the fridge. It has exactly what I need for my refresh. So it's, I usually don't have to discard. So I got my starter in there, and I'm going to add my water. All right, and then at this point, I like to dissolve the starter in the water. This is just going to make sure that it's well mixed, and it's going to really ferment at a good rate, and make sure you just get all those little lumpy bits out of it.
So pretty important. You had cold starter when you had really hot water. What's the desired end temp that you're looking for?
I like my rye starter to be around 85 degrees. Maybe like around that temperature. I'd say give or take 2 or 3 degrees on either side. And a lot of the time it's going to depend on what time of year it is. Say in my bakery here, I don't really have good climate control. So in the summertime, I'll actually use a little bit cooler temperature because I know cooler water temperature because I know the starter is going to acclimate to the room temperature quickly. And now that it's getting a little cooler, I start to use warmer water because it's probably about low 70s in here. And so I like to get it up a little higher first, so that way it can acclimate and still give me all the vigor it needs.
And if somebody was using room temperature starter and feeding room temperature starter, they'd be using a lower water temp.
That's correct. Yeah, of course. Yeah. So like Andy said, as I pulled this out of my refrigerator, it was 35 degrees Fahrenheit. So rather than like waiting for it to acclimate, I just use warmer water to bring up the temperature.
And David, real quick question from Jeremy Churfus. And hi, Jeremy, by the way. Jeremy provided a great homeschool session a couple months ago. But Jeremy was asking if is there an error in the starter? Asking total weight should be 150 grams. I think he was just kind of looking at the recipe and making sure that.
Thank you, Jeremy. That is correct. I missed the typo there. I can change that in the document. So if it's linked to the document, I can edit that. But thank you, Jeremy. That's correct. So this here is the first build. That's it. You don't really need to mix it too much. You just really want it to be well homogenized and combined. You don't want to see any dry flour in there. And then we're just going to let this sit at room temperature for another 4 to 6 hours. And then we're going to do that starter build 2. So we'll set this aside. And in the meantime, we're going to move on to that soaker. So the soaker is another component of this bread. The soaker allows some of that rye flour to hydrate. I mean, I think of this as like a flavor bomb that I'm kind of adding to the final bread. You don't necessarily have to use a soaker, but I like to do it just to, like I said, it adds a lot of flavor and it really just makes it a little bit more complex. So in this soaker, we're going to have some toasted sunflower seeds. We're going to have some of the rye flour and some caraway seed and also some old bread and some salt. The caraway seed, I actually like to grind with the rye flour. I like ground caraway seed. It just kind of makes it a little less sharp whenever you bite into it. It also gives you all that aroma, which is really nice in a rye bread. You get this really nice sweetness to it. And on top of it, caraway is really good for digestion and things like heartburn and stuff. So it also has that benefit as well. So as I said, some of these mixes are a little bit big because this is for my my mix tomorrow. So I'm going to add the sunflower seeds. I'm going to add the salt. Here I'm going to mill. I milled most of the flour already in the caraway seed, but I got a little bit I'm going to be doing here just to show you guys how I do it. It's all pretty simple. We got this nice mock mill here, and I kind of grind it, not on the finest setting, maybe a little bit coarse. What's really nice about these are just super simple to adjust. And it's going to be a little bit loud here for a second, but that's it. So I go ahead and put the rest of that in there. And then one other ingredient I didn't talk about yet necessarily is the some soaked old bread. So if you look on this formula and on the paper, I don't actually have it as a part of the formula. That's just because you might not have old bread on hand at first. So you got to start somewhere. But if you do, you can add a certain percentage to your bread. And old bread is kind of a very traditional ingredient in rye bread. I think probably initially it was made because people didn't want to waste the bread, but it also has a lot of complex flavor and just really, I've made the bread without old bread before, and it really takes on a whole different flavor profile with the rye bread, and I really do prefer it. It's incredible. It adds to the texture and all sorts of little things. So what I did earlier today is I took my old bread and I covered it in water. And old bread holds about 4 times its weight in water. So another thing, whenever you're formulating a recipe like this, it can be kind of confusing to try to like figure out how much old bread you actually are trying to put in your starter in your bread. But I try not to worry about it too much. Just because the bread, it already contains all the ingredients in the bread. So you don't really have to overthink it. You just need to make sure it's well hydrated. You don't want there to be any hard pieces. And if there's residual water, that's okay because we're going to be adding water to this soaker anyways. So, you know, it can be kind of observed in the moment a little bit. Rye bread's very interesting because, or rye flour, I should say. I've used many different grain varieties of rye, and they all seem to have their different absorption rates. So your rye might not actually absorb this same amount of water I have here. So you are going to want to kind of adjust, and I'll be showing you some of like the viscosity you're looking for and some of the textures that we're kind of after for when you actually have that complete dough. So that way you can kind of adjust in the moment whenever you're pulling it together in the end there.
And rye is like really slimy and sticky, and it's sort of, if you're used to making wheat bread and you've never tried a bread like this before, it's more like you know, working with concrete or
right.
You know, it's really nothing like, there's no dough that really gets formed that you're familiar with.
Right.
Very,
yeah.
Very different.
I've actually used that analogy to like, I kind of think of it like concrete. Like if you've ever mixed concrete or like mortar or something like that, it kind of has a very similar texture. You know, it's a little bit gritty. You know, you could like almost, you know, it's just squish it into a pile, but then it just kind of wants to fall apart on you. But yeah, it really is, it doesn't feel anything like wheat, that's for sure. All right, so back to this soaker. I've got my toasted sunflower seeds. I've got the salt. I've got the rye flour. And one thing, this is all the salt for the recipe. We're not going to be adding any additional salt after this. So I've got this all scaled out, so I'm just going to go ahead and put it in here. And I soaked it, and then I actually squished the rye bread maybe about like an hour ago just to make sure there wasn't any additional like drier bits in there. I like to squish it up in the container before I actually add it to the bread, so that way I'm not necessarily trying to find any lumps while I'm actually incorporating this together. And then too, I might add some more water to this too. It's starting to look a little dry. One thing about sunflower seeds, they also absorb water. Yeah, do you want to throw a little water in there for me? Maybe just like 100 grams or so, 200 grams. Yeah, that's probably good. And at this point too, we're not necessarily going for a perfect look here. As I said, we just really want all the flour to come together. We don't want it to be really stiff or hard.
Dan, I'm going to move over to our mobile cam here.
But yeah, we're just kind of going for a pretty, loose. I mean, it's mostly sunflower seeds, so it's really not going to come together too much. And that's about it. We're just going to, I like to push it off to one side of the container. And you also might be saying, like, why am I using this huge container? This is actually going to be the container I'm mixing the dough in too. So this will actually save me a dish when I go to mix the final dough. Yeah, just scrape the sides. I'm kind of crazy. I can't stand like if there's one sunflower seed over here, I'm going to scrape it, I just feel like if I scrape up all this stuff now, I'm not going to have to clean it up later. So,
and just so you can kind of get a little sense of what it smells like over here, the toasted sunflower are so aromatic, and all the oils that get that kind of umami smell and flavor. And then the ground caraway, you can already anticipate how much flavor is getting packed in here. That old bread is a pretty great trick and a very old-fashioned, old-world process. And in Germany, they actually allow up to 20% old bread in their baking, and most big bakeries take advantage of that. And it helps with shelf life, it helps with moisture, and then the aromatics and the flavor just is kind of enhanced and kind of blown up. We were eating some rye bread in Dusseldorf, Germany, and staging at a bakery and trying to figure out how this bread tasted so good. And it turns out their trick was the old rye. All right, Dan, we can go back to the Steadicam.
Steadicam. All right. So now we've got our soaker prepared. I'm going to touch back on this starter number 2. So, like I said, with rye, you need to build it up. You need a pretty high volume of starter compared to wheat bread. So this second starter is going to get us to that point, and this is actually already done because this is what we're going to be using for the demo. But like I said, you're going to want to wait about 4 to 6 hours after you do that first build to do the second build. And then once it gets fully fermented, what will happen is it's going to rise up and it's going to level off. And that's when I like to put it away. I put it in the refrigerator overnight. And that's also going to allow all those enzymes to break down. It's going to build up a lot of acidity. And we're going to end up with a pretty sour culture here. And that's going to help bind that rye bread together. So
Damon, I'm going to jump right in with a question, if that's all right.
Sure.
Just a couple of questions, just getting back to the old bread. One is just a little confusion about the amount of old bread that's called for in the recipe. And then the other one is about getting the old bread sufficiently soft to be ready for incorporation. So if you could just fill in just a little bit more info on that.
Yeah, sure. So on my recipe here, I've got old bread. So in this stage, I've got it it's dry. So I actually, I have old bread. I've got like a little piece of rye that I can use. And I can then, I let it dry out. And I mean, for like 140, 10% of, so if you're not familiar with baker's percentage, that's kind of how I have this broken down in here. So for old bread, I've got 10% of the flour weight as dry. So I would take about 180 grams of dry old bread and then add 4 times its weight to it in water. So that would be probably about half of this for the recipe. I mean, yeah, this is 170 grams right here. So, I mean, if that helps you at all with clarifying that. But yeah, then I'd go ahead and take this, put it in a bucket, cover it with 4 times its weight in water, and let it sit there for about, I mean, I like to do it maybe like 3 or 4 hours before I mix the soaker, just so that way I know it gets really soft. And as I said, I go through and actually squish it up prior to mixing the soaker, just to make sure I didn't, lose any hard pieces of bread in there. Some people I've seen, they'll actually like slice up all their old bread. They'll make little like crackers out of it essentially, and then use those in their bread. For me, I just don't ever have like that much lying around that I should make a bunch of crackers, and I tend to bake pretty dark too, so like, it's already pretty well toasted, so I'd rather not add too much toasty flavor to the rye bread. Does that help?
I think so, yeah. Thanks for filling
Yeah,
that.
sure. All right, so now we're gonna pretend it's tomorrow. We've got our soaker prepared. Our starter has been sitting in the refrigerator overnight, and we're able to combine all these components we have. This.
All right, Dan, let's go over to the handy cam.
And get some hot water. And you can pass me that thermometer on the green box behind you. Thank you. All right, so you've got cold starter. We've got our room temperature soaker. I've got my flour already scaled out. Once again, I tend to mill. It's pretty fine, but it's not like super fine where it would clump together. You can still feel some of the sandiness in it a little bit. Yeah, so once again, we've got cold starter. So we're gonna have to use hot water to bring up that dough to its proper temperature. So in the summertime, I use maybe about, I don't know, like 145 to 150 degree water. And now as it starts to get colder, I can get up to even like 170 degree water, just so that we can reach that around 85 degree final temperature that we're after. So,
which is a solid 10 degrees higher than your average wheat dough. And you usually,
sure.
Rye seems to like it quite a bit hotter all along the process, the starter, the dough.
Yeah, rye is interesting because what happens with rye, it doesn't build gluten like wheat does. That's what holds the gases in wheat bread is gluten. Whereas in rye bread, rye is full of all these starches and gums, and that's what provides the structure. So what ends up, and it's also really naturally high in sugars compared to wheat. So what happens is the enzymes that are present in the rye flour, once you add water to them, they ferment really quickly because there's so much sugar already available. So what happens is it ferments really quickly, and what happens is something called starch attack, where the gums and starches ferment too rapidly, and the bread just collapses in on itself because it can't hold that structure together, because those enzymes have broken down all those gums that are holding on to the trapping the air.
And when you get that, you can look at a slice of bread. So this is a slice of finished bread. If you had, they call it floating crust. So in the very top crust here, you probably experienced where that pops and separates. So that can be a bunch of things, but that is usually starch attack. It sounds as bad as it is.
Yes. Yeah, and then your bread collapses, and what you'll notice happens is the rye bread in the oven, it'll collapse. And when you take your bread out to slice it, you'll actually have this big gap in between the top of the crust and the loaf. And that means it's over fermented essentially, and it couldn't trap the air. So what I'm gonna do now is I like to scrape the sides of my container. And once again, these are already scaled out. I've already reserved the starter that I needed for my mix tomorrow. It's here, and
So if you wanted to, you could use a rougher cracked rye. If you liked more texture, you could use like a rye chop. You could even use, nearly whole rye berries if you soak them long enough. Just depends on the texture that you're looking for. So a lot of the ryes in Germany or Austria would be super fine and very smooth, and then some would be kind of more hearty.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. I've experimented with some coarser rye, and I've been making this bread like this is the same exact bread I make week in, week out for my customers. And I've been making it so long, I've tweaked it here and there, and this is kind of where it's at. And I found that I don't know, I like it a little bit finer. So I'm going to scale my water out. Today I'm going to be using 150-degree water. Let's see. And then we're on this final dough here. So we're going to take that 944 grams of water.
David, there's a question, and I think this was more around working with a starter, but asking if there's risk of killing the sourdough start with too hot of water. Jill was thinking that the yeast dies at 138 Fahrenheit.
Yeah, I mean, maybe some of as you'll see, maybe some of the stuff that's on this outer side gets mixed, but by the time you mix all these ingredients together, it's going to drop so quickly that, you still have plenty of viable yeast cells in there. So, we're on this cam? Okay, sorry. Yeah, so there's still plenty of viable yeast in there. And like I said, I've been making this bread for a long time, and I initially thought that too myself, but I haven't encountered any problems with it, unfortunately. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and just start pouring this in. And then I'm going to reserve a little bit of water too. And that's just because I said as before, your rye might absorb water differently than the rye that I'm currently using. So water is always one of those ingredients you can adjust in the moment. Like if you, if it feels dry, it means it probably is, and you probably should add some more water. But with rye, we're going for general viscosity. That's kind of what I like to shoot for. So first, I like to kind of start breaking up the soaker, just to make sure if there is any lumps or anything that I missed. This is my last chance really to get them. So yeah, just like you're just squishing it between your fingers, and then I'll go ahead and start getting the soaker or the starter too. And you might have to work quick. If you have sensitive hands, if it feels a little hot for you, maybe you use a spoon at first to make sure that hot water doesn't scald your hands. But I think if you start squeezing the soaker and the starter, it really cools down so quickly that it's not too bad.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but that seems really satisfying. Is that a fun thing to do?
Oh, I mean, all these textures, and not to mention the smell. I love rye bread. This is my favorite bread that I make. So I don't know.
And it's not a very sexy analogy, but the concrete analogy I think is very appropriate. If you've ever buried posts using Quikrete, and you're out there and you kind of add a little bit of water, a little bit more, and then you get that perfect equilibrium where it's smooth but not too thick and not too wet.
Right.
Hydration changes so quickly with different crops from different farmers and different crop years and different ages. If you bought a grain that's been sitting around for a year and a half in Colorado that got really dry, maybe that grain is 9 or 10% moisture versus the 14% that you would buy from the store. Hydration is such a huge variable.
Yeah, in the same way with concrete though too, you can still make it work. No matter what, if it feels a little hot, a little wet, what's nice about this bread is it's a pan loaf. So you're putting it into a pan, and that can usually help save a lot of things. If you've got a saggy bread, sometimes if I'm experimenting with something new and the grain doesn't respond the way I want it to, and it's really flattening out on me throughout the mixing and the pre-shaping, I'll put it into a pan, and at least at that point it's salvageable, and then the next time I can adjust accordingly. But with this rye bread, it always goes in a pan, so you can get away with pretty, not too far off. Like, you don't want it to be too wet, but then again, I'd rather have it be a little bit too wet than too dry. So yeah, we're gonna go ahead and add our flour now. This is really well mixed up. The only lumps and things I feel in here are the sunflower seeds at this point. So I'm gonna go ahead and add my flour, which is about 899 grams here. And as I still haven't added my other water, might not need it. We might need it. I can say from the way that initial part feels, it feels a little dry. But we'll see how this comes together. And then I'll make sure all the flour is fully hydrated, and then I'll adjust the water if it needs it. And you can never take water out. So always remember, you can always add, but you cannot remove. And then one thing you also notice here is, I've got a clean hand too, and I'm kind of holding the container with my other hand, and that'll just help you work clean. And if you go to grab your bucket of water, you're not getting a bunch of, rye dough all over the place. And then
you're still on first speed, right?
Yeah, this is first speed. You always want to mix rye only on first speed.
On first speed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Rye, as I said before, rye doesn't have gluten, so we're just looking for it to all absorb. You can't develop the gluten or the structure by adding folds. Sometimes if you have some wheat flour in there, you might have one, but for whole grain rye bread, it is not necessary.
And you're just trying to hydrate as much as possible, which you've done through your old bread soaker, your old bread. I know sometimes bigger bakeries that are doing production of rye bread will have a diving arm mixer and will mix for like 45 minutes.
Right.
Mostly just to have that friction and continue to get more water.
Yeah, and a lot of times for coarser grind too, because it takes a little bit more for that hydration to happen. But especially since this is pretty finely ground overall, it absorbs super fast. And not only that, we've got that big sourdough culture bomb in there that it is already fermenting at this point, so rye bread, you kind of have to work quick. So for me, this feels a little dry. I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more water. I'm just going to go ahead and add the rest of this.
So consistency right now is sort of like a cookie dough. Almost.
Yeah, it is like cookie dough. I'd say that's a really good comparison, but a very sticky cookie dough. So yeah, I'll go ahead and scrape down the sides really well. There's a little bit of unincorporated flour. That's there. Another thing about keeping a clean hand, you just, these tools stay clean, and you're not just making a big gigantic mess all over everything. I think that's the hardest thing about baking, is cleaning up after yourself. So if you can save yourself some time and have these little tricks that just kind of make you keep your tools cleaner, it can really make your baking experience a lot more enjoyable.
So keeping your scraper in water is a good trick too, right?
Right, yeah.
So
I always
kind of lubricates it.
Right, I always have a scraper and a little bucket of water whenever I'm mixing. It lubricates it, and it just helps, it keeps the dough from sticking. And, you can dip your hands in it if you need to. I'm just going to add a tiny touch more water here. And then too, I'm going to check my temperature right now. Just because if I add a lot more hot water, if it's already at the right temperature, it's just going to boost it up. So this gives me a little opportunity to adjust. But we are at 84.9, so we hit it right on the money there. So I'm going to go ahead and use my, I'm going to make some what I call relatively room temperature water over here, just so that way I'm not raising or lowering the temperature at all.
And using a thermometer may not be something you're accustomed to at home. This little guy is called a Javelin, and you can get them online for about 25 or 30 bucks. It's relatively instant read thermometer, so you're not sitting there for 2 minutes waiting for it to temp out. Really good and kind of critical kitchen tool, baking tool.
All right, I think that's looking pretty darn good here. Yeah, so once again, back to that concrete analogy, you know, it's not stiff. I mean, you can still see it's kind of moving a little bit. I mean, it's obviously really sticky. That never goes away, but this is kind of the viscosity you're looking for. And what that's going to allow for is proper fermentation. If it's overhydrated, it's actually going to ferment really fast because you actually increase that enzyme activity. But, you know, if you get that viscosity right, it'll ferment appropriately. And same thing if it's too dry, it won't ferment quite as quickly, and you could end up with that starch attack situation because it's not fermenting appropriately. So I'll just go ahead and scrape off my hands here a little bit. And then with this bread, there's no bulk fermentation like you have with the wheat bread. We're just going to go ahead and scale this right into pans, which I have already oiled up. And you're probably thinking, like, how am I going to scale this out like I do with regular wheat bread? What I'm going to do is actually just put the pan right on the scale. I'm going to zero it out. And then I'm just going to take my hand. I just wet my hand. And I'm just going to kind of take a nice ball and put it in there. I usually try to shoot to get about like half of it in at a time, just because that way you get nice consistent pieces and you can kind of move through it a little faster if you've got a big batch. So these are going to be scaled to 1,000 grams. I mean, these are some pretty, what would you call this, like a 2-pound pan loaf? Would that be the standard, pretty standard size? You could find these pretty much anywhere. So yeah, I'm gonna go up to 1,000 grams. And you're not really trying to get like, or 1 kilo, whatever you wanna say. You're not really trying, it's not very pretty at this point. Let's face it, rye bread isn't as pretty as some of the wheat breads out there, but I think it's all about, you know, flavor, shelf life. And you get these so many wonderful things with rye bread that wheat bread just doesn't quite have it sometimes, you know? But yeah, just keep moving through the dough until you have it all in there.
I don't know. I think that's very pretty. I bet you guys agree. And you know, the moisture and the denseness of the bread allows it to last for, you know, a week or more in a plastic bag and stay delicious and great every slice for at least a week, if not a couple weeks, till it molds anyway.
Well, if you let it dry out, it won't mold. You gotta just not put it in a bag.
So we've got a little bit of pan release in those.
Oh, right. I actually, so I don't use pan spray. I just have some sunflower oil, and I just take a paper towel and I rub the insides of them. Yeah, so that's all I do.
Which is fine because a pan spray is really just has lecithin and stuff in it, so it sticks on the side of the pan if you're doing a million pans in a, you know, big environment. But if you're just doing it a few loaves at a time, you can use your oil of your choice that is okay, has a high smoke point.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I on that too, I feel like you always want to do, if you are doing that, you do want to oil relatively, you know, close in proximity to when you need the pans, because as Andy said, that pan spray helps it stick to the walls. So if you say oiled these the night before, that oil is actually going to fall to the bottom of that pan, and your loaf might end up sticking to the sides. And then, so one thing about that old bread, so this formula gives you 4 kilos without the old bread. So if you have old bread, you're going to end up with a little bit extra. So maybe you got a little pan that you can use. You got a friend that you like, and nice cute little rye loaf, you know. And this one, I didn't zero that out, but it's all right.
That's how you get your kids liking rye bread, right? From an early age.
Right.
You're like, no, look how small and cute it is.
Yeah,
It stays strong and sour and full of caraway, but
that's rye peanut butter and jellies were actually one of my kids' favorite snacks for a long time. But he doesn't like peanut butter and jelly.
Baker's son.
Right. But now he stopped eating the crust. You know, it's kind of funny how that all comes around. All right. That's good enough. All right. Yes, I'm relatively clean here. One other thing, if this was me and I was working by myself, I'd clean this container right away, just because this 1 hour later is going to be kind of a chore to clean. So I'll leave this stuff here. It's going to be fine. And then I'd clean this, but because we've got the TV magic going on, I'll keep moving. So next step, we're going to actually press the loaves down, so make them nice and smooth on top. So what you want to do is wet your hands, and then what I do is I like to do them all a little at first, just because my hands are a little oversaturated. That way I kind of spread the water out. I don't really want any puddles of water forming on top of here. But yeah, just take your knuckles and spread it down. So it's nice and flat, just like that. If you don't do this, your rye bread, you know, it's going to ferment a little funny. I mean, it probably still look pretty cool, but I prefer this method. But that's one thing that's nice about the pan is everything's going to stay in here. Do the same with this little guy.
You ever do these stencils on a bread like this?
Yeah, that's how I did those a lot when I first started this bakery, and it was always stenciled. With that, you can do that, but you'd want to let it proof all the way at this point, and wait to do the stencil, right before you put it in the oven. For about 2 years now, I've been kind of going more of that traditional look. So what we got to do here is, where did I put that? Here it is. Is we're going to sift rye flour over the top of it. And that's how we get all those nice cracks. So what happens is, we sift the rye flour out on top, and the loaf rises, and these cracks just naturally form. And what's really nice about those cracks is they're a really good indicator of when to put it in the oven. Whereas with that stencil method, you don't really have as much of an indicator. You're just kind of going purely off volume. Those cracks are telling you that it's starting to, that starch attack could potentially set in if you don't get it in the oven soon. So,
Hey, David, sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, Liz was asking just, since you're going back to it as well now, it's great, but just to kind of give a quick re-explanation of that starch attack scenario. And then in addition to that, if you have time, or if not, we can get back to this too, but she's asking if you want to start a rice starter at home, how would you suggest they start it, and what would be a good feeding schedule?
Yeah, great. So let's talk about that starch attack real quick, just because it pertains to this. So starch attack is essentially is not quite like over fermentation, because it's not really fermenting in the same way as wheat. But what happens is the enzymes that are present in the rye, they break down all those present sugars and also those gums and starches that are holding the bread together. So if it ferments too slowly, that's what will happen, is that starch attack.
Where it will kind of eat itself alive.
It eats itself alive, essentially, yeah. And what's interesting about rye too is that what do they call it, amylase degradation, that doesn't start happening until the bread reaches 170 degrees. So there's still even potential for that starch attack to happen while it's still in the oven. Say if maybe you're baking at a low temperature. But a great book that talks about a little bit, I've got this, The Rye Baker by Stanley Ginsberg. He talks about starch attack in there. As much as, I'm into the science a lot. It's definitely a part that I try not to focus on too much. You know, I feel like when I'm making bread week in, week out, you know, I learned so much in that process that you just kind of adapt as it goes. And like, honestly, like, when did we even find that starch attack even existed? You know, people have been making rye bread for a long time prior to that. So all this new information is very helpful for us to understand what's actually going on. But I don't think you necessarily need to think about it too much while you're baking. But it just essentially means it's not fermenting fast enough. And like, you didn't use enough starter, essentially, and you don't have an acidic enough environment to slow down that enzyme activity. So, you know, it's kind of a mouthful, but yeah, there's lots of good information out there if you're interested in learning more about that starch attack. Now, touching on the rye starter, if you've already got a wheat starter, you could just maybe use a small pinch of that and then adapt it over the course of a couple weeks. You could, you know, just like I did this first build, I think you could, you know, you could even make this bread starting with a small amount of wheat starter for this starter one, and then do the second build, and there's, you know, it probably still come out great. But if you do want to make this rye bread a regular thing in your repertoire, I think, you know, I think the bread will ferment better. I think having a culture that has the grain you're using just makes it ferment more appropriately, and it's more acclimated to fermenting that kind of flour. So yeah, but yeah, you could start with your wheat starter, or you could start with rye flour. You could just take 100% rye flour, or equal parts flour and water by weight, and then, you know, once again, keeping in mind that temperature. And then about 3 to 5 days later, you'll start to notice some sourness and some bubbles maybe forming. And at that point, you can start your building process. And, you know, by that I mean I feed it once in the morning and once in the evening for about 3 or 4 days, until you get some predictability in that fermentation. But yeah, I mean, rye is so active, and it, you know, you probably get activity within a day or two, I think, with using 100% rye flour. So now,
and I'll just add too, real quick, David. Mona, the bread lady, provided a great tutorial on starting a wheat starter, I think, in our first homeschool series. So you should be able to find that on the coloradograinchain.com website to get to that link. All right, go ahead.
All right. So now these are going to probably take about, I don't know, 2.5 hours to proof, 3 hours. That's going to depend on your room temperature. I kind of think of it like when you're going to let this rise to where it's almost the size you want it, you think it's going to be, you know. And actually, if you pull up, there's a photo on that spreadsheet I gave you guys, and it's the second photo. You'll see there's some rye loaves on the left side that are proofed, fully proofed, and then that second photo is actually the finished loaf. So as you can see, that rye loaf raises up and it starts to form all those cracks, much like this bread has here. And that's your indicator, and that's when it's time to go in the oven.
So like right now, we've got about 2 fingers down from 2 of my fingers down from the top. How many fingers would it be over the top when it was ready to go in the oven?
With these, it's pretty much it just as it's starting to crest up at the top of the pan. Yeah. Rye, like I said, those cracks are a great indicator of dough proofness. So that's usually what I use, just because, you know, you don't want to let it over ferment. So once those cracks start forming, I know it's time. I got to get them in within the next 20, 30 minutes or so. But yeah, so what I'll do is I'll cover these up. I'm going to set them off to the side here. And I'll just get a board, put over them. And then I've experimented with some different things over the years. Like for a while, I was leaving them uncovered. And then sometime I'd leave them uncovered in the beginning and then cover them up halfway through. But lately I've just been covering them up, and I've actually been adding been a little bit heavier on the flour. What I've noticed is if I don't use enough flour and I cover them up, the dough actually starts to absorb all that flour, and you don't get those cracks that form, and you just kind of lose that indicator, and you don't get that nice, I don't know, that contrast with the crust, which I desire. Doesn't mean it's going to be bad, but if you want it to look like this, flour it heavily. You can always dust off the flour, if you need to. So yeah, cover those up, and then 2 to 3 hours, they're going to proof. We're not going to be doing any baking today. Rye bread takes kind of a long time to bake anyways. So, but what I love about rye bread is you don't need any fancy ovens to bake rye bread. You can use your regular old still oven at home and make incredible bread with what you have. I do like, if you do have a pizza stone, I think that can help, just because you get that oven spring. You don't need it necessarily, but if you can preheat a pizza stone in there, that's going to kind of help maybe get you a little bit more volume initially. But as you can see, once again on that photo, yeah, those are the proof loaves, and then the finished loaves on the, on the spreadsheet. Sorry, I'm going to keep going on the frame.
You're good.
Yeah. But a lot of it is, like I said, it's going to depend on your environment, how warm your room is. That can really affect that final fermentation rate, which is why it's so important to get that water, or that final dough temperature right. So that way it's going to ferment along as you need it.
So don't cheat and use a thermometer.
Yeah, don't cheat.
Yeah.
Don't think you just know. Don't assume.
Don't use a finger thermometer.
Right. So yeah, and two, if your dough is cold, or if your dough is cold, you might be in some trouble. But if it's not too cold, you can kind of put it up high somewhere in your room. It's always warmer at the top of the room than it is at the bottom of the room. So always keep that in mind. And vice versa, if your dough's hot, it's summertime, I always try to put it in the lowest spot in the room I can find. So that way it gives me just a little bit more flexibility. And if I know I hit my dough temperature right, I know it's going to ferment along without me worrying about the final product. But yeah, always being aware of where you're keeping these. Right now we've got like perfect 75 degrees in here. This is my favorite time of year to bake. So yeah, things just kind of cruise along and they're controlled. Whereas in summertime, if you've got a big bake day, it's a scramble because everything is fermenting so rapidly. So, I mean, that's pretty much it for that rye bread demo. Is there anything you want to cover? And then I was going to show you how to make a quick rye cracker, an unleavened rye cracker.
Just one question from Renee asking about acidity. Could it be provided by something not sourdough?
Yeah, actually, I mean, I think with rye bread, it's not as common, but a lot of like wheat breads, they'll use what's the cherry powder is a popular thing to add acidity, or ascorbic acid. There's a lot of these dough conditioners.
Acerola cherry.
Right,
Yeah.
That one, yeah. So there are some things that bakers do use to increase acidity, but I wouldn't know how to,
I think all like the cherry powder and the ascorbic is more often used as like a dough conditioner in a pretty low percent. You'd have to add a lot of it to get that.
Right. Yeah. Right. For sure.
I think you're wanting to do flavor through fermentation, the acid flavor. We make a bread at Moxie that's a very similar bread, and we've over the years discovered if we use a really teeny bit of starter, like it's like 0.44%. It's a teaspoonful in our rye soaker that has all of the water and almost all of the ingredients except the salts. And that ferments overnight. That gets really sour.
Yeah.
But I mean, I just ate this and it's really full flavored sour. It's a caraway kind of notes come in, the toasted sunflower comes in.
Yeah,
but,
it's tart.
With the rye bread, you're going to get really sour kind of no matter what. So
right.
It'd be hard to make an insipid low flavor rye bread.
Yeah. But then again, too, you wouldn't say take like a dough conditioner and try to estimate the pH you're going after. and add yeast and assume that that's going to provide that strength. You know, that sourdough culture does, you know, it's doing two things. It's fermenting the dough, it's controlling that enzyme activity, and also, you know, it's proof, you know, it's all your fermentation right there. So yeah, I wouldn't know how to calculate something like that using, say, a yeast and some sort of dough conditioner to try to bypass the sourdough starter.
I think there's a tartine recipe that calls for stout in the rye bread. I think Renee's
Right.
and not a sour flavor necessarily, but a really cool another depth if you took a porter or stout and added that as part of your liquid.
Right. Right, too. And you could say if sour isn't necessarily like what you're after, you could say add some molasses or something sweet that kind of just balances out that tartness to your dough. Or beer. I've used up to 50% of a beer to replace the water in many of my breads without, you know, affecting fermentation. So yeah, I mean, you can get pretty creative with this stuff for sure. But yeah, I mean, this is a pretty basic rye bread. You could take out the sunflower seeds and the caraway and just strip it down to just a plain rye bread. But I mean, I think those toasted sesame seeds add some really nice flavor, and you know, that caraway, I just love caraway, even though some people can't get into it too much.
So when you're baking this, you got so much water that you need to drive off, and you're really looking for not a gooey crumb. So like bake time and checking is super important to make sure that it's almost like the cake toothpick test.
Sure, yeah,
coming out.
For sure. I think rye is very similar to cake, and like sometimes the appearance, how it bakes. But yeah, so when you go to bake your rye, if you're using just a conventional home oven, I would say start around maybe like 480 degrees Fahrenheit and initially, and then maybe about 15 to 20 minutes into the bake, turn it down to 400 degrees so it can finish baking, it can dry out. The reason I start up high is because I want to get that oven spring. If you start baking low, it could potentially undergo that starch attack, or you just won't get quite a nice volume and maybe not quite a nice crumb structure. But most importantly, you want to dry it out. Since it is such a high hydration bread, this one is actually more than 100% hydration. So it's very important. You wouldn't say want to bake this at, you know, over 500 degrees and assume it's going to, you know, bake it in a half an hour and then expect to be able to slice it. I would say bake time is probably close to an hour and a half for this bread. And I mean, I kind of go off of color. That's how I bake. I don't necessarily temp anything, but I think what's internal temperature for rye bread, they want around like 200 degrees or something like that.
Yeah.
If you wanted to temp it. But I'm also just going for color. I guess that isn't a good indicator if you have a crazy oven temperature or something like that. But yeah, like I said, just bake it up, start at a high temperature, drop it down. In this book, they talk about baking rye bread anywhere from, you know, 500 degrees all the way down to 250 degrees. And then I actually saw this cool video of these people they're in Iceland, and they're making rye bread with the thermal, you know, they're digging up holes in this thermal ground and burying this essentially like a coffee can in the ground, and it came back 24 hours later, and boom.
Well, that's good. The gnomes were down there baking. Right.
Right.
So yeah, and there's bakeries that are making that Westphalian pumpernickel that are baking at a really low temp for 24 hours at 250 Fahrenheit or so. I got advice from a German baker that said, get the internal temp to 195 Fahrenheit and then have it, and then bake it another half hour.
Okay.
So once you hit 195, which is kind of hard to know exactly, you know, how long has it been since it's been 195 Fahrenheit, but that makes sure that you're drying out that inside as much as you need to be.
Yeah, and I think that just goes with everything about rye bread. Is it you know, it can vary a lot in the process. You know, water you have to adjust, oven temperature, but it's really flexible, which is kind of nice. You don't have to have And I'm coming from my perspective. And one reason why I bake this bread is because I work with an oven that has retained heat. It's a falling oven. So the rye bread gives me something else I can bake with that lower temperature. So it's really nice if you're a small bakery to be able to do something additional. I think what's nice about the process is you have all these components. It's pretty quick to throw together. And I think it's pretty easy to fit into a bake schedule if that's something you're after. But yeah, should I do this rye cracker real quick? It's really fast. It's not leavened at all. So there's a link to this recipe. It's actually a Peter Reinhardt recipe. I don't make these in my bakery, but I had all these ingredients and I wanted to do one more thing, and these were perfect. Super simple, easy to do. And you don't have to be a sourdough expert to pull it off either. So where's that? That's right here. Cool. All right. So what we got in here, we got some flax seeds. I've got some sesame seeds, pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds. What did I say? Yeah, I've got all the water scaled out already. And then there's a little sunflower oil. And we're also going to be putting a little honey and some salt in here. So first I'm going to go ahead and grind up these pumpkin seeds and these sunflower seeds real quick. And this just is going to actually, most of this is, I think it's about half of it's seeds. It's not mostly rye flour. So you get a lot of nice nuttiness and lots of protein in here. So I'm just going to grind these up a little bit. In the recipe, they say to grind these first and then grind the flax separately. But because it's such a small amount, I feel like, I don't know, it's probably going to take me forever to do it. So I just kind of grind the first seeds initially, and I add the flax about halfway through. Well, that's pretty good. I actually used a food processor for this last time, and I didn't quite get it to this stage. So I think this looks a little bit nicer out of the blender. So go ahead and put those seeds in a bowl. I'm going to add, notice I did not ground the sesame seeds. We'll add the water. There's the oil. And then obviously the rye flour. And I got to add a tablespoon of honey too. That's what it calls for. I didn't measure this out because it's honey. It's hard to get out of the container, so I'll clean up after it.
Salt?
Yeah, salt too.
Salt.
Yeah. That's pretty good. And I think it says like what does it say, a third of a teaspoon? Because I got this is like some flake salt, so I'm gonna kind of crunch it up just a little bit to make sure I don't have any big clumps in there. And then, yeah, this is all the ingredients, all in here. Just go ahead and mix it up.
Speed one.
Speed one. And this recipe, I didn't alter at all. I took it right from the book. You could add other seeds to it, probably. I'd probably keep the seeds in the same proportion as they are in the recipe, just because it might get a little too crumbly if you put too many seeds in there. But it should come together pretty well. And you just really, like the same thing, you just don't want to see any unincorporated flour floating around. You just want to make sure all the honey is well incorporated and the oil and everything's really well mixed.
And this recipe and these sort of Scandinavian cracker recipes work well with wheat. They work well with brown rice flour too, if you want to swap out and go for kind of a gluten-free option. Just adjust your hydration a little bit.
So you'll see it's a little tacky still. That's okay. So what we're going to do with this is actually put it in the refrigerator overnight. I think that helps with the tackiness. It helps develop the flavor. It's probably going to start fermenting a little bit too, so you'll get probably a little bit more character out of the dough. But yeah, I'll just go ahead and wrap it up. And I've got some that I made earlier, or I made yesterday.
I think it was Peter Reinhardt who helped to sort of figure out and publicize that when you were soaking grains, bringing on the enzymatic activity, you start to approach the level of pre-digestion that sprouting does. So a lot of times just by soaking for 10 or more hours, you're getting a much more digestible, end product.
Yeah, really? That's cool. Yeah, so I think in the recipe it says to break it up into 4 sections. I'm not going to do that right now just to save some time. But yeah, let me just go ahead and store this in the refrigerator. And then here's the one I prepared the other day. This one I did actually break into a couple sections. But yeah, I see it's not super tacky anymore. You can handle it. And this, we're just going to roll out. And it is going to be a little crumbly. I noticed that when I did them the other day. But I'm going to go ahead and sprinkle a little bit of, I'm using rye flour again, just because I might as well. That's what we're talking about. So I just kind of get it started on here. And then what I'm going to do is going to put it between some parchment paper, just so I can get it a little bit flatter, and it also helps keep it from sticking. So
if you have a well-equipped kitchen and you have a Silpat silicone mat, those work great too.
Yeah, or wax paper. I think we're not going to be baking it on this particular piece necessarily, but we're going for about I think it's a 1/16 of an inch is what it says in the recipe. And then just kind of finish it out. And then too, if you're really particular, you want it to be a certain size, you can go ahead and kind of patch it. If you're going for perfect squares, you can drive yourself crazy until it's perfectly square. And then, where did I put that pizza wheel? Here it is. So at this point, say it's probably not quite a 1/16 of an inch, but I'm going to cut it anyways. You could use a dough scraper. You could use a pizza cutter. Pretty much anything. This is kind of nice because it gives you a little bit of an edge. That kind of looks nice. And
probably more important that it's all flat and level, and there's no low points or high points than the actual thickness, right? Because it's those really thin spots that burn, and you're waiting for the thick spots of the cracker to bake and get crunchy, and so
yeah,
be methodical when you're rolling the stuff out.
They end up being chewy too. You get these chewy spots. And then, yeah, you want to leave it like this. At this point, I should have transferred it to my other piece of parchment paper, but I'm just going to do this real quick. Just because I don't want it to fall apart on me. And I'll slide it onto this sheet pan. And that spray bottle next to that light there. In the recipe, it says that you can use egg wash, or maybe if you're making a sweeter type of cracker, you could, just to get the toppings to stick. So for me, I'm just going to use water, kind of give it a nice little spritz. And then here I've just got the same seeds as I've got inside. I didn't put the flax in, just because it can kind of burn a little bit faster than some of the other seeds. And go ahead and sprinkle them on. And And what you can do is take another piece of parchment paper. You can just kind of press them in. Otherwise, your seeds are all going to fall off. Like that. And then we can go ahead and bake these in a 300-degree oven. And then I'd say it's maybe about 30 minutes or so. And if you got to, just make sure, if your oven's a little inconsistent, maybe you have to rotate the pans or switch them around. But yeah, about 30 minutes or until they're at your desired color. And yeah, they're a great little snack. And that's pretty much it for the cracker. And then here's the final product over here. I'm not sure if Andy already showed you, but yeah, these really nice little crackers. I was really happy with them. My wife loved them. Yeah, super easy. I mean, I don't know. I'm always like kind of fixated on sourdough, but making something like this is like, oh, maybe everything doesn't have to be. And especially with that that time in the refrigerator, it definitely, like Andy said, converts a lot of that into more bioavailable food. So little things like that just make it, and you get all that flavor. And on top of it, if you're not used to working with rye flour, this is a great little introduction. That way you can get your feet wet and get used to that texture that rye has.
And someone emailed in asking about rye and other applications outside of sourdough, and we talked about the crackers, and a lot of people are making really good rye chocolate chip cookies.
Right.
We're going to try to dig up a recipe. You can Google it, but it's a pretty easy and really flavorful substitution. And it's kind of funny because the chocolate chip cookie really isn't about what kind of flour. It's about the butter and the sugar and the chocolate chip. And so to use rye flour in there and have a more nutritious base is kind of cool.
Right. Yeah, and you could do like nice little tart shells with rye or something. Maybe make a pie crust. Have you ever made pie crust with rye or anything like that?
Sounds fun, huh?
Yeah. I mean, and then too, if it's something new to you, I'd say you could use it up to 20% in your normal country dough recipe too, and start experimenting there with adding rye to your breads. Just keep in mind that rye does ferment faster, so maybe you want to reduce that starter percentage in the bread a little bit, just because that you are adding a lot of more natural sugars and fermentable things. So it will ferment faster than your normal wheat bread, but it'll still hold on for sure. But yeah, I think that's it for the demo. I think we're pretty much close on time here. Is there any questions? Anything that you need some more clarification about?
I think we're pretty darn good. We'll share questions with you and comments in the chat and stuff. So if there's anything that we can follow up with afterwards, we'll try to do that as best we can. But thank you so much, David and Julie, for the contribution. And, I know we didn't get to the nutritional benefits of rye, but maybe we could focus on that a little bit too if we, get into some cookies and pie crusts and stuff like that. But so grateful to have you guys today. This was a great session. And then just for folks on the call, don't forget about that upcoming bake sale to fight against racism on October 17th and 18th. And we'll be in touch with other stuff. And once again, thanks for joining and making Colorado Grain Chain strong. So thank you, David.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today.
All right. Have a great one.